Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ashley Leonard, the Associate Director for the 2 and Through Middle Grades Network. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 2 and Through Research Spotlight. Our topic today is using incentives to boost attendance with Dr. Carly Robinson. Before we get started, I want to share a couple of announcements. So we have a couple other events coming up similar to this one. So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of those before we jump into the presentation. Next Tuesday, we'll have a research spotlight featuring Dr. Shante Robinson and Dr. Kelly Halberg talking about how to support students, homeless students, and help them beat the odds. Then on May 24th, we'll have our monthly data collaborative with our friends from UIC discussing their work to better support Black enrollees. And finally, on June 9th, we'll have another research spotlight where Kids First Chicago will discuss the CPS enrollment crisis. We're excited to dig into each of these topics with you, so please RSVP by clicking on events at the top of the 2 and Through webpage. My colleague May Malone will drop that link in the chat now in case you want to sign up today. We're also really excited that today we're going to host our first post-discussion event. This is an optional session that is directly based in response to your feedback. We really hope that this new space will give you a chance to connect with other attendees and process today's spotlight through a reflection question from Dr. Robinson. The question is designed to help you kind of understand and unpack the implications of her presentation on your own work. So before the session ends today, we'll be sure to drop the details in chat so that you can join us. Please do note that that is a separate Zoom link because right now we're in webinar format, and that obviously will be a space for discussion. So just be mindful, it is a separate link that we'll throw in chat at the end. All right, now let's get to the reason we're all here. I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Carly Robinson. Dr. Robinson is a Postdoctoral Research Associate at Brown University's Annenberg Institute, where she works with the National Student Support Accelerator. Drawing on insights from social psychology and behavioral science, she develops and tests interventions to improve educational outcomes for students. Prior to conducting educational research, Dr. Robinson worked as a New York City teacher. Before I turn it over to Dr. Robinson, I want to remind you that you can add questions to the Q&A box throughout her presentation, and we will have time at the end to discuss some of those questions with the full group. And now with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Carly Robinson for today's presentation.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Thank you, Ashley, for that introduction and for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you all today about the idea of using incentives to boost student attendance. And I'm going to be sharing results from an experiment I conducted several years ago in collaboration with Yana Gallus, Monica Lee, and Todd Rogers on symbolic awards and how they impact student attendance. And so before I start, I do want to note that everything I'm presenting on here occurred before COVID. And so I think the takeaways are still relevant, perhaps even more so given the focus on absenteeism of late. But the pandemic is going to add a nuance to lots of school policies, I think, and especially those focused on attendance. So I think it's worth keeping in mind as we think about the implications for this work. So, our motivation for conducting this study was pretty simple. The practice of using awards to motivate positive behavior is ubiquitous in our daily lives. And this is largely based on the intuitive appeal that recognizing effort and performance with an award will result in improved or continued positive performance. I would say over 80% of corporations reportedly use awards in some capacity, and you'd be hard pressed to find a school that does not offer student awards for something. Turns out often it's for attendance. And it happens on a national level too. Each year, millions of students receive President's Education Awards, which come in the form of a pin or a certificate. And so in looking at how awards impact behavior and trying to learn more about that, we focused on attendance. And This was born out of both of the facts that some of my collaborators and I are attendance researchers. We conduct interventions to figure out how to increase student attendance, but also that one of our collaborators really focused on awards and how they can, really motivate positive behaviors. And so we sort of joined forces and wanted to study what happens when you offer awards for attendance. And much of the research on awards to date has focused on performance. And so we focused on attendance for a few reasons. One, because it really hadn't been focused on before, but absenteeism is a major predictor of student dropout and educational failure. So interventions that improve individual attendance could have major downstream ramifications. We also focused on attendance because, like I said before, awards are already commonly used to incentivize better attendance. We asked a group of educators if their school or district offers recognition or awards for positive student attendance. And the vast majority reported that yes, they do offer students attendance for attendance. They do offer students incentives for attendance in some capacity. And we got this by surveying, a lot of educators, but I also thought back to my experience as a teacher myself and my colleagues and friends who are teachers, and everyone has that experience of, doing something because students had a positive attendance. And in fact, the state of California actually introduced legislation that encourages schools to recognize students for having positive attendance. So it's really, built into the fabric of what we think schools do or should do. And I think that this idea of incentivizing student attendance is, really particularly relevant, given that the pandemic has exacerbated absenteeism across the country. And practitioners, rightly so, are actively looking for ways to entice students into attending school more. 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the New York Times specifically about attendance incentives and using them to combat the issue of chronic absenteeism. And, it really highlighted all of the things that schools are trying to do, from gift cards to having food trucks at schools. Like how can we actually get students to attend school more? And these are some of their ideas. But even with all of these incentives and awards for attendance out there, we really don't know that much about how effective these awards are. They're happening, but we don't know, how much they improve attendance or what happens when you give them. So this is where our research comes in. We partnered with 14 school districts in California to conduct a randomized field experiment to examine whether awards are effective at improving attendance. And we thought they should be. We focused on students in grades 6 through 12. And we had a couple of research questions and corresponding hypotheses that we pre-registered before looking at the data. And what pre-registration means is that we basically publicly posted documentation that specifies exactly what our hypotheses were and how we were going to analyze the data. So we were pretty confident in our hypotheses and in our approach. So first we wondered, does offering awards impact individual attendance? We specifically were looking at symbolic awards. And so symbolic awards are basically an award that is given, but has no financial cost. And so schools, like using symbolic awards to recognize positive behaviors because they avoid the financial cost of monetary awards. And actually some research suggests that symbolic awards may be less likely to crowd out intrinsic motivation. And second, we wondered whether symbolic awards are more effective at motivating behavior when they are offered prospectively or retrospectively. And what that means, so a prospective award is when you have the opportunity to win an award. So you're aware that if you behave in a particular way, you can win an award. So it's based on your future behavior. And so awards can also be offered retrospectively. And so a retrospective award is when you receive an award for your past behavior. And because you didn't necessarily know that there was going to be an award, it can come as a surprise. And they might work because they show that the recipient, that someone like a teacher or a school leader is appreciative of or proud of or cares about their performance in this domain. And then therefore, it's worth repeating. And, in the literature on rewards, most attention has been paid to prospective awards, particularly with regards to performance, but scholars have really started to explore the effects of unexpected recognition, largely thanks to the advent of behavioral research and the focus on how gift exchange and reciprocity may affect behavior. So I told you that we had sort of our research questions and our hypotheses. And so what do we predict is going to happen? So our first pre-registered hypothesis was that both versions of these symbolic awards would result in students attending more school as compared to the control group who did not receive awards. Excuse me. And our second pre-registered hypothesis was that the prospective awards would be more effective at improving attendance than retrospective awards. And, to add a little suspense, I'm going to tell you that we were right on one of our hypotheses, so you can make your predictions as I describe the experiment. I'm going to take 1 sec to take a sip of water. Great, sorry about that. So here are the details on our intervention. We randomly assigned students to receive one of three conditions: a control condition, a prospective award condition, and a retrospective award condition. The control condition received no additional communications beyond what is typically sent by schools and districts. And so at the end of January, during this school year, students in the treatment condition received letters home in the mail. Students assigned to the prospective award condition were told that they would receive a perfect attendance award if they had 0 absences in February, and they saw a picture of what the award would actually look like. Students assigned to the surprise retrospective award condition were told that they earned an award for having perfect attendance in a fall month and actually received the award enclosed with the letter. So here's a picture of what the certificate that I teased before. This is just what it looked like. We did splurge a little bit. I'm so sorry. Tickle on my throat. So we printed it on slightly slick, thicker paper, but beyond that, it really had no value. And in both conditions, we were told the award would not be offered again that school year. We told students that. So because we wanted to test the impact of getting an award for positive attendance in the past, we needed to ensure that the conditions were equitable. So we limited our sample to only students who achieved perfect attendance in at least one fall month. So 0 absences in either September, October, or November. And about 88% of students had at least one perfect month of attendance in the fall, and therefore qualified for our study, leaving us with over 15,000 eligible students. And our main outcome of interest was how many absences students had in February. So that's the experiment. That's how we implemented it. What did we find? And so, like I said, we predicted that the pooled award treatment conditions, so both the prospective and the retrospective awards together, would be more effective at improving attendance compared to the control group. And we found no evidence that students who were offered a symbolic award in general had better attendance than students in the control group. So looking at these graphs, the y-axis here is days absent, so the lower the bar, the better. But if you recall, we did get one of our pre-registered hypotheses right, and that was that the prospective awards were more effective than the surprise retrospective awards. But that was only because the surprise retrospective awards actually made students go to school significantly less in February. So when you break out the results by each of the 3 conditions, we see that the prospective award had basically 0 impact on average. And students in the surprise retrospective condition actually missed 8% more school in the target month than students in the control group. And these students were also 2 percentage points less likely to have perfect attendance in February than the control group for what the award was for. And so 63% of students in the control group had perfect attendance in February compared to only about 61% of students in the retrospective award condition. So to put that in context, currently the most effective interventions, attendance interventions out there probably reduce absenteeism somewhere between 6 and 15%. So by increasing absences by 8%, we basically found a way to undo it. And so contrary to what we intended, we managed to design and implement an intervention that made kids attend school less. So at first we had no idea what to think. The results were exactly opposite of what we predicted. Thankfully, the effect was still on the smaller side because we're talking about students being absent from school here, but it still appears to be a robust finding. So we wanted to learn more about the underlying mechanisms. And so we did some exploratory analyses on our data and found a couple of interesting things. First, we looked at how the effect may have differed by students' academic performance. We found that the increase in absences in the retrospective award condition was driven by students who had lower academic performance. So higher achieving students didn't seem to be affected by the awards, but students who were lower performing and who received an award for their past positive attendance ended up increasing their absences in February. Next, we wanted to see what happened when we looked at students' absences in the following month, which was March. We found that students in the retrospective award condition did not continue to increase their absences compared to the control group, but students who had been offered a prospective award for perfect attendance in February were more likely to have more absences in March. So it seems like once the award period ends, student absences increase. And this was true for both the retrospective award condition and the prospective award condition. And because now we have the benefit of 2020 hindsight, we realized that the offer of these symbolic awards with absolutely no value weren't motivating students to attend school more. And they may have just been sending them signals about their behavior. So we wanted to conduct a follow-up study that attempted to understand what these signals might be. So to explore this, we conducted an online between subject, what we call a Vignette Experiment, where we asked participants aged 18 to 29 to imagine they were a student, and it was the end of January during the school year. So the idea is that we assigned young adults to read a vignette that mirrored the actual field experiment, and they were assigned to the same 3 conditions. So the control group did not learn about any award. The prospective condition learned they received a letter saying they would receive an award if they had perfect attendance in February. And the retrospective condition learned they received an award for their prior attendance in the mail. So basically, we're just describing exactly what happened to this group of online participants. Then we asked participants if they thought, hypothetically, that they had more, the same, or fewer absences than their classmates, putting themselves in the shoes of the experience that they just read about. So participants who read about receiving the retrospective award reported far and away believing that they had fewer absences than their peers. So this graph is showing that the percentage of participants who believed they had fewer absences than it's showing the percentage of participants who believed they had fewer absences than their hypothetical classmates. And so participants who read about the opportunity to earn a prospective award also believed that they had fewer absences compared to the control group, but less so than those in the retrospective condition. So this finding suggests that awards, particularly retrospective awards, signal to students that the descriptive social norm among their peers is to attend fewer days of school than they themselves attended. So it's possible that this perception would lead students to conform to the norm. And in this case, the norm is attending less school as opposed to more, as we would normally hope. We then asked participants about their perceptions of school's expectations for their attendance. And we see a similar pattern. Participants were asked to report how high they thought their hypothetical school's expectations were for their attendance. And so participants who learned about the retrospective award also assumed that their school had lower expectations for their own attendance compared to both the other conditions. And even the offer of the award for future attendance appears to lower beliefs about the school's expectations for student attendance, but not quite as much. And so these results, signal that awards did signal to recipients that their schools did not expect them to attend school as much as they did. So I think that this experiment really provides some support that conformity to descriptive norms and low institutional expectations might be the underlying mechanisms that leave students feeling licensed to miss school. And students maybe who don't have great experiences at school because they're not performing well in school may be more likely to act upon that licensing effect. And so they receive an award saying that they had this perfect month of attendance, and then they are able to justify to themselves, to their parents, whoever might be, missing a future day of school. So finally, we described the nature of the intervention to educators and asked them to predict what they thought would happen when students receive retrospective awards for their positive attendance, whether it would result in students attending school more, the same, or less in February than if they did not receive the award. And this was a sample of over 200 educators. And only 2% actually correctly guessed that providing students with a retrospective award may demotivate student attendance. So, like us, practitioners had no idea that these awards may actually hurt behavior, which makes me think that most people share these incorrect intuitions, and that's why they continue to implement symbolic awards for attendance. So there are a few takeaways. I think a lot of people are using awards to motivate student attendance, and they think they're going to work, but they can backfire because the awards may be sending signals about student behavior. And I'm going to come back to these takeaways more in a bit, but I don't want to just leave you with cautionary tales and interventions that you cannot implement. I want to talk a little bit about some, maybe more positive interventions that we can use to improve attendance. And so earlier I mentioned that the most effective attendance interventions increase student attendance by 6 to 15% at least. So I'm going to share some examples where my research team and I actually did some good and got kids to engage in positive educational behaviors like attending school more. And we can sort of put this in context with the awards experiment that I just shared. And so I think the first example I'm going to share with you is this mail-based intervention that encourages parents to improve their children's attendance. And so this intervention was designed to correct some of the misbeliefs that parents hold about attendance. And in particular, parents tend to, particularly in the early grades, sometimes undervalue daily attendance for their children. And they also tend to underestimate how many days of school that their child has missed. It's actually really hard to keep track of how many days of school your child has missed over the course of an entire year. And so particularly when students have a lot of absences, parents underestimate by a factor of 2. So if a student has 20 absences, and on average, when we ask their parent how many absences they had to date that school year, they would say 10. So in this intervention, parents in the treatment group received 6 personalized mailers over the course of the school year. And each mailer emphasized the importance of regular school attendance during the early grades and the utility value of attending school. And they also reported the total number of days that the student had been absent to date that year. So parents had accurate information on how many days of school their child had missed. And we found that the intervention reduced the number of days students were absent by 8%. We also saw that this effect translated into a 15% reduction in chronic absenteeism. And in a follow-up survey, which as you can see, we like to do, we found that the treatment parents who received mailers were more accurate in estimating the number of days their child had missed that year, and they were more likely to believe in the importance of regular daily attendance. So, now at this point, this intervention has been replicated many times and has been made stronger. And this research actually spun off an organization called Everyday Labs, which now helps school districts send these letters to parents to actually reduce student absenteeism. So it's an example of an evidence-based intervention that's really reaching lots of students now. In a similar parent-focused study, collaborators and I partnered with a large school district that is mandated to send students' parents truancy letters after they are absent for 3 days. And so this is what on the screen, what the original notices looked like. And so in addition to being very hard to read, and written in 10-point font. The text is legal, punitive, and is at least at a 10th grade reading level. And I frankly don't understand what it's trying to say or wants parents to do. So we partnered with the district to test out different types of letters that use different, in this case, behavioral insights. And so we found that the most effective condition cut down on the text and actually simplified it. It emphasized that absences add up and can have a negative effect. It highlighted parental efficacy and that parents can make a difference in getting their kids to school more. And it moved all the mandated legal language to the fine print. And so this condition reduced the likelihood students were absent in the 2 weeks after receiving the letter. And this was a 40% improvement over the standard notice. And so finally, I think I'm going to just give one more example before circling back to the takeaways. I think one of the potentially more positive side effects from the pandemic is the emergence of really helpful educational resources that are offered by schools and to parents for free to support their students. And there are tons of educational resources out there that could really help students, but they're only going to work if students actually use them. So my research team and I conducted an experiment where we tried to increase student attendance in virtual on-demand tutoring sessions. And this is actually, this idea of virtual on-demand tutoring that students can log on whenever to actually get help is increasingly available as for students as districts contract with providers or actually build their own networks of making this happen. And so to test it out, we randomly assigned students. This was in partnership with a district in California. We randomly assigned their 6th through 12th grade students to one of 4 conditions. And so there's the control group that received no additional communications beyond what was standardly sent by the district about the virtual on-demand tutoring platform. One group of students was assigned to the student-only conditions. And so students received weekly emails that encouraged them to reach out to tutors. They also received a one-time initial mailer at the beginning of the semester that sort of introduced the tutoring platform and provided relevant information. Students were also assigned to the parents-only condition, and in that condition, students' parents, not them, received also weekly text messages or emails reminding them to encourage them to reach out that their child could actually log on and attend a virtual tutoring session. And then in the 4th condition was a combination of the student and parent only. Both students and parents received the initial mailers and weekly communications via email or text message. And so here's an example of what both, no matter condition, either students or parents received a mailer, and in the case of the student plus parent condition, both received a mailer. And so here's an example of the parent mailer. There's a Spanish version on the other side, and it basically explained that this was a free tutoring resource available to students and how and why they should encourage their students to log on. And the student version looked very similar to this, but it provided actionable information and some the following messages, text message or emails to parents or students built on this initial mailer. I think most importantly, it came along with a cool branded Post-it note. So there was this physical artifact that might remind them to that there was this platform that they could log on to get help from a tutor whenever they wanted during that semester. And so at baseline, we see that only 19% of students actually ever attended these virtual on-demand tutoring sessions. So that's not very high, given that it was available to all 6th through 12th grade students. We see that just the student-only condition really didn't increase whether the likelihood students attended any virtual tutoring sessions. But when we sent these messages to parents, there was about a 6 percentage point increase that students actually logged on and received help from a tutor. Most effective, though, was the student plus parent condition, where we're targeting both parents and students, communicating this information to them with an initial mailer and then on a weekly basis. And that was about a 46 or almost 50% increase, not in absences, but in attendance of attendance to these virtual on-demand tutoring sessions. And we see that the average number of sessions that students actually attended by these conditions was highest in the student plus parent condition as well. So it's still a low baseline, but there may be opportunities for supporting students and parents together to increase attendance and students' positive educational behaviors. So to circle back to the takeaways, awards are common and people think they work. We find that there are certain scenarios, and in this case, symbolic awards for attendance, where they don't work and actually demotivate the target behavior. And so I do want to note here that I don't think that awards are always ineffective. There appear to be instances when they do motivate people and students, and there may be many places where we need more research. But I think there's something about using symbolic awards for attendance that just doesn't work. And it may be because attendance is something that you're expected to do. And in the case of students, they may actually not even like doing it. And so these meaningless certificates that have no value likely just send a signal that you're attending school more than your peers or that you're overshooting institutional expectations for attendance. So hopefully this work and future research can help school leaders and organizations think more critically about how they're using attendance awards to incentivize behaviors and when they might backfire. And I think the other takeaway is that there are other non-incentive based attendance interventions that seem to work. But I think that the results I shared are a cautionary tale that we actually need to be consistently evaluating whatever interventions we put into place to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do or what we think that they're doing, because that's not always the case. So, thank you for being here, and thank you to my co-authors in the collaborating districts, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carly. Thank you for sharing. That is a very interesting outcome, that it was kind of demotivated, and we're getting some questions in the chat about that. So let me start with some of those. And again, for folks who are listening, again, please feel free to continue submitting questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first question is, how did you decide to focus on students in the grades you chose? And kind of to complicate this question a little further, in the original experiment, did you see any differences in outcomes based on grade levels at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the reason we started by focusing on middle school students is because in this case, we were mailing these awards directly to the students. And so we felt that there sort of needed to be a once you hit middle school and high school, you have a little bit more control over whether you're going to attend school or not. Largely in elementary school, yes, students can sort of, I think, can play a role in whether they go to school. But it's much more, the onus is much more on the parent or guardian or whoever is in charge of getting them to school. Whereas in middle and high school, you can take a little bit more, like I said, onus over that behavior. So that's why we focused on 6th through 12th grade students. With regards to the difference in grade levels, we did see some, this is exploratory, but suggestive evidence that it might, the prospective awards, so the award for the future behavior, might have been slightly positive or like effective at increasing student attendance in the earlier grades. And so grades like 6 and 7, it actually might have motivated some positive behaviors from students. It was, as we start to slice the sample so many different ways, it's sort of, like we said, exploratory finding. But I think it's a really good question about like the developmental age of where students are, and whether maybe this might be something that actually could work to some extent for younger middle school students. That said, the effect still wasn't very large, and so if we're going to put these interventions in context and think about like how much effort's being put into actually communicating and creating and giving the awards. And again, they're symbolic. So the whole point is that they don't cost very much, but there still is, this cost to actually getting something like this up and running. I'm not sure if the like magnitude of the effect is necessarily worth it, even when we did see these potentially positive effects.
Great, thank you. So kind of continuing with that original experiment, What does the research say about collective incentives? Because this was really focused on, to your point earlier, like your hypothesis was around the individual impact. So if we can get average daily attendance to, 92%, everybody gets a pizza party. Has your team done any research on those kind of collective impacts and seen any differences?
Yeah, we have not looked at that. I think it's funny that you say that, because that's like specifically what I remember happened in our school. It was like our class got a pizza party because everyone was there for, the last week. Everyone was, in class that last week. I think it's really interesting, and I think that there is a potential for that to have more motivating factor for kids. And again, it's also not a symbolic award. Like a pizza party is like an action, like something that you get at the end that actually has value. Whereas this paper, you can like imbue it with value, but it's still just like a piece of paper you could potentially hang on your wall. I think that there also is this other issue now, and like I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I appreciate it, and that it's a question as to whether we should be incentivizing perfect attendance in general. I mean, that became very obvious in the wake of COVID, because like, please do not come to school if you're, coughing and have a runny nose and so on. And it might, be stigmatizing to students who have disabilities or may have to miss school for different reasons. So I think it's a question of whether awards for attendance is the right thing to do in general, even if they did work. But I think that something like a collective incentive that had people, where there's a little bit more accountability and also working towards something that students actually might want could be more effective at actually increasing attendance. Although again, we have not studied it. I would want to study it because again, it sounds like something that would work and would be good, but as we know, these things don't always play out that way.
And then let's see, I think one more question about this before we get into some of the other incentives you kind of tested after. What kind of hypotheses do you have about whether the original treatment negatively impacted attendance through changing the perceptions of expectations among parents, students, or both?
Yeah, so great question. One thing, again, I did not show here was another exploratory finding, and we saw that in, I believe it was, we looked at the difference. So that was the outcomes I showed you were looking at both excused and unexcused absences. When we looked at sort of which one was driving this sort of like excused versus unexcused absence, the result in students missing more school, it appeared to come from more unexcused absences.
Oh, interesting.
And so that to me, and like, this is a little bit of a, like, I think I'm speaking beyond what my data says, but like, this is my, like I said, hypothesis, is that by getting this award, it's like, then you have this, like, you're like, look what I got. I had a perfect attendance, in a month, like they're recognizing me for it. And like that, like, this is a conversation started with a parent that like, in both cases, student and the parent might like feel okay if a student missed a day in the coming month. Yeah, that's one of my working hypotheses, but I think, these were mailed to students and specifically wanted, they addressed to students, but obviously it's going to their home, something that their parents might see. And I think that there's definitely an interplay there.
Yeah, great. We're getting lots of good questions, so I'm just trying to go through and group them a little bit.
Gives me a second to take some water because clearly I had an issue with that.
No, all good. Let's go to this question and then we'll kind of come back. Have you looked at all at whether attendance incentives have the same impact on younger students, like students in grades K through 3? Kind of going back to your original question, like, have you guys done any experiments on that? Or do you find that because the older students do have more kind of responsibility and more onus, that it kind of makes a difference in that way?
Yeah, so frankly, after this, where we like felt quite bad that we made kids go to school less, again, small effect, but it was not the point. We have not really done much additional work on attendance incentives, in part because, like I said, this like 2020 hindsight thing where we thought about what the award's actually communicating. I do think, like, and this goes back to that parent piece and the mechanism. I think that if it was an award for K-3 students, maybe students would come home being excited about receiving an award, and that might motivate, their parents to, if there was to actually really focus and have a backup plan if they couldn't get them to school one day. That being said, it does feel like it's more like on the parent to get the kid to school. And if a kid's sick, like a kid is sick and they probably shouldn't go to school, even if they're going to get a cool award.
Okay, and then one more question about the original experiment before we kind of get a little bit into the vignettes experiment and some of the other things you spoke about. What do you think is the best way to maybe try to do some of these types of controlled experiments for schools themselves, right? We have a lot of practitioners that join these sessions. How might they try to test out some of their own theories on what might or might not work for their students in a school without kind of a bunch of researchers like yourselves to kind of support it at that scale?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And so obviously, like, to be able to like put a, stake in the sand and say like this X causes Y, or incentives lead to worse attendance, we have this, randomized feature where we're randomizing students to conditions. That is much harder to do for a practitioner, although not impossible, but it's much harder. And I think there are ways to design sort of strategies, interventions, programs, whatever might be, in a way that allow you to learn more about whether something's working. And so that might mean, let's just say there's like a strategy you have for increasing student attendance. Maybe you roll it out to like a subset of students at the start of the school year. And then, a few months in, you can start to evaluate, how the kids who received this, were a part of this group that were involved in this strategy, what their attendance looks like, and you compare it to the group that didn't receive it. Maybe it wasn't randomized, but I think you can still start to learn about trends, and start to see if something may or may not be effective. I think there's also it's just using data to sort of track things over time. So even if you're not staggering the rollout of something, you can follow trajectories of student data and look at, the before and after of when maybe a specific intervention happened. And I think in the end, it really does come down to that data use piece. You're really not going to know if it's working if you're not sort of in there looking at the data. So that's sort of step one. And you want to think about, when you're designing these sorts of things, where do you think you're going to have the impact? What data you would need to see that impact, and making sure you're collecting it in a way that allows you to track it and gain insights, and ideally continue to like adapt the program based on what you learn.
Wonderful. I hope that insight helps some of our practitioners on the call get some ideas.
Or partner with researchers, because we love this stuff.
Yes, that's true. Yes, we're always happy to help, right?
Yeah.
So another question is, in your vignettes experiment, your team seemed interested in how perceived social norms can negatively impact attendance rates. How can educators potentially change those norms or help shift those mindsets students or parents may have in ways that would be helpful, and maybe without incentives? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And so I think one of the things that emerged from all of this is that excuse me, is that the award was sending this norm that this perceived norm that we didn't anticipate or know that that's how it was going to be perceived. And so I think that's happening all the time with lots of things that we do. And I think that happens when you think about the defaults that parents are given, excuse me, that's not the right way to say it. We're thinking about the choices parents are given for engaging in a lot of their schools, engagement activities, let's say logging into a parent platform. And this is some research that some of my collaborators have done, by doing something where sending a message by being Ashley, you are automatically logged in to your student's platform. click here to log in and get this information so you can actually learn more about how your student's performing in school, see data, et cetera, versus making them actively, sign on, create an account, do all these different things. Like little communications like that changes, I think, what the perceived norm is. Because if you're automatically logged in, the perceived norm and expectation is that that's what you should be logging in, you should be doing this, versus like, this is an additional thing that you can do if you choose to.
Right.
And so that's one thing. I think the other thing is that schools, I don't think always, some are very good, but many are not great at inviting parents to engage in their kids' education, whether that be, communicating with teachers, but also like thinking through and supporting parents and getting their kids to school. That's not always like the conversation that's happening between people in a school and parents. And so if that becomes part of the culture, and then I think that starts to change the norms about what is expected from parents and engagement. And so I think there's also, ways to design interventions and do this, but I do think that it's like a bigger cultural issue in the school and climate. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. To your point, there's a lot of things that are often communicated that we're not aware are getting communicated that need to be addressed to kind of really understand some of these things that came up in your study. Oh, and another question, in the experiment involving attending school every day for success, the mailer to parents, there were no mandated consequences listed. Were there these kind of consequences listed in the standard notice? So like, how did consequences play a role in this? Like, are they all simply kind of positive behavior reinforcements? Or have you ever found that there's a difference when there's a positive, but there's also a negative? And how do you kind of going back to that communication piece a little bit, how does that play out as well?
Yeah, like in the standard notice, the consequences were like, if you do not respond and your child does not attend school, you are eligible for jail time. And so like the consequences, though stated very confusingly in legal language, were pretty severe and punitive. And like, I could imagine be like really off-putting to receive after your child has their third absence of the year. And so that information actually remained in the fine print. We did, I think, test another condition. So what I showed was the most effective condition that reduced absenteeism over the next 2 weeks. We did test another condition where we highlighted there was one of the benefits and the consequences. And it was not, it did not add anything, I will say. One piece of the mailer that I think is important, it's, I guess it could be a consequence, but it's that these absences add up. And like there are, so they can, like students who have more absences sometimes are not learning what they need to learn by the end of the school year. And so I think that is a consequence that parents can actually like internalize and think about acting upon as opposed to jail time. So I think there is a different, way of thinking about that and phrasing in a way that can be motivating as opposed to demotivating.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let me just double check that we've gotten through. I think we have a couple more. I think we answered that one. Oh, yes, and that one. I guess one question is, just beyond the ones you've tested, have you heard of or seen any other incentives that might be effective or have a bigger impact on students, whether from the literature or from work you've seen other colleagues do?
There's been some work on incentives for like things like test like performance or things like that. And I think to some mixed results, there's a lot more studies out there that I would say that have tried to incentivize like performance. And so that's why we're interested in this attendance focus, because it's more of like an input and something people can actually, I think, have a little more feels over control over. Performance you do have control over, but it's like 2 steps, right? And so there's definitely mixed results there. And I think that they do find, when you start to get into monetary incentives, sometimes the bigger the incentive, the more likely people will be responsive to it, at least in the near term. I think there's a question as to whether that, like, receiving a monetary incentive for doing, like, having reaching a certain performance level, but once that incentive goes away, you might stop trying as hard or return to baseline or whatever that may be. The other incentive that I think is interesting is thinking more about, like, and I think, again, it's tough with attendance, but incentives like we talked about earlier with peers and from, like, colleagues when it gets to the workplace. And so I do know of some research where like it was actually with Wikipedia, and you can post things on Wikipedia, and you can with Yana Gallus, which was one of the collaborators, she did this. This is you receive, like, this sort of surprise award after this retrospective award that is for your contribution and effort to the site, and that did actually motivate performance. And so I think that was maybe, like, that's more of an unexpected behavior that you're not actually, like, attendance is one of those things where you're actually supposed to do it, and so it's weird maybe to get an incentive for it, because then you're like, oh, did I not have to do that? Anyways, I think there is stuff out there. I do think that attendance is a little bit funky when we start talking about incentives.
Great. And then I think one more question that kind of popped up for me as you were talking, kind of the intrinsic motivation piece. What are kind of some of your insights on the connection to the intrinsic motivation, both to attendance and other kind of in-school factors where there is a little bit more control? How do those things kind of connect? You mentioned it a little bit in the earlier part of your presentation, but we're curious to hear a little more.
Yeah, and this, like, I think this speaks to what I was just talking about in the response to the last question too, and thinking about, like, oh, when people are incentivized for their performance, they do really well, and then it starts to, like, once that's taken away, they actually don't perform as well because they have lost, they were externally motivated, and that external motivation is gone. And it's possible that there's evidence that once you give external motivation for something that you were intrinsically motivated originally to do, then you lose the intrinsic motivation. And so that is one reason why we were interested in the symbolic award, because we did feel like, it's less likely to crowd out that intrinsic motivation, because it's not like you start to associate attending school with getting, like, a gift card every day that you show up, which I think could definitely, once the gift cards goes away, even if you were originally, like, intrinsically motivated, goes to school, it's sort of like, it feels like you're losing something, and you're looking for that external motivator. So I think in terms of designing both attendance and other interventions to try to encourage students to engage in positive educational behaviors, it's thinking about how those, like, it really comes back to me, like, this study and experiment was such a great lesson for me, to thinking about how it's going to be perceived by the student, and how, like, they might be interpreting these and how it might affect their motivation. And if they were someone who was going to attend school because they, like, that's what they enjoy it, that's what they want to do, and then they're getting an award for it, and then they're like, wait a minute, it starts to make them second guess, what their own intrinsic motivation is for some reason. I just think there's, like, that thought process and, like, running these interventions by actual kids before you run them, which is something that I try to do now.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much again for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. I'm sure folks were surprised by some of the insights, and I'm sure there's lots of things swirling in their minds that they want to discuss more. For those of you that do want to continue to discuss, like we mentioned earlier, we will be having our first post-spotlight discussion. So we'll drop the link and the agenda in chat one more time. You will need to switch to a new Zoom link for that session. But there'll be small breakout groups. You can further discuss some of Dr. Robinson's findings and what you heard in her presentation today. She's actually going to join one of the groups. So one lucky group will get to ask her some more questions and pick her brain even more. But we really do hope you'll join us for that. Again, you can also go to the To and Through website to check out the events page for future research spotlights and data collaboratives that you can join to learn more about research like this and to interact with your colleagues about these great topics. So thank you all again so much for joining us today. A huge thank you again to Dr. Robinson for joining us and sharing her research. And we hope
for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.